All right, y'all, welcome back. Next up, we're going to be talking about rhombuses. And before we get too much into the details, we're going to go back up to the front of our notes, very first page, and we're going to put rhombuses in this second blank, first one on the left. That's because a rhombus is a type of parallelogram. So parallelograms are at the very top. Rhombuses are below them. They are a special type of parallelogram. And what makes rhombuses special is that rhombuses have 4 congruent sides. So a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides is called a rhombus. So in a rhombus, since it's a type of parallelogram, the opposite sides are parallel. Every parallelogram has 2 sets of opposite sides. So RB and HU, RH and BU. But not only are the opposite sides parallel, the opposite sides are congruent. And in fact, all of the sides are congruent. So we can go ahead and fill that in. RB is congruent to BU, which is congruent to UH, which is congruent to HR. So we're going to put in our markings for all 4 sides because they are all 4 congruent. Next up, we're going to talk about the angles of a rhombus. And just like in a parallelogram, in a standard parallelogram, the opposite angles are congruent. So let's fill that in, congruent. So that's angle R and angle U are congruent. Angle H and angle B are congruent. And the last thing we know about the angles, well, not the last thing, but the last thing in this section about the angles of a rhombus is that consecutive angles are supplementary. That's the same as with parallelograms. So they add up to 180 degrees. Okay. Next thing we're going to talk about is the diagonals. So we're going to draw those in, H to B and R to U. Those are the diagonals of our rhombuses. And just like with parallelograms, we're going to go ahead and put in a point in the middle. I'm going to call this one point M. And since this is a type of parallelogram, we know that the diagonals bisect each other. They split each other in half. So RM and MU are the same. They're congruent. RM is congruent to MU. And what is HM congruent to? Go ahead and fill that in. HM should be congruent to MB. They're the 2 halves of our other diagonal. Now we do have one other thing that we know about the angles, and that actually has to do with the diagonals as well. That's that the diagonals bisect the vertices. Remember that word bisect means to cut them in half. the diagonals bisect the vertices. So I'm going to take each of my original 4 corners and I'm going to cut them in half. So angle R, it's now made up of those 2 congruent angles. Same with angle U. Since U and R are the same from here, we can set, if we cut each of them in half, those are all 4 the same angles. The same thing applies to angles H and B. Each of them being cut in half gives us 4 new congruent angles. And the last thing we want to talk about with a rhombus, this is the last special property, is that the diagonals intersect at 90 degrees. They are perpendicular. So there should be a right angle right there in the middle. Make sure you have all these notes down in your notes. Complete your assignment for today. Next time we'll be talking about rectangles and squares. But until then, y'all have a good one.